I'll explain that to the court. We know that the defendant destroyed evidence in this case, namely the biggest piece of evidence of them all, the body of Savannah. She concealed Savannah's death and went to extensive efforts to conceal Savannah's death. We know that the defendant drugged Savannah. I will argue to you, Your Honor, that the jailhouse snitches that you heard from, Miss Wohlen, Miss Johnson, and Miss Hilton, are credible. Robert Pete Jr. is also credible for the reasons I'll outline in my argument. Savannah, the evidence showed that she didn't die in the trailer. She died in the burn pile. And I'll recap that evidence for the court. And then there's all of this evidence of consciousness of guilt on the part of the defendant. Now, first off, let's talk about Savannah and her suicidal ideations. You heard a lot of evidence, or rather, the defense introduced a lot of exhibits, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of medical records from 2016 when she was living with Miss Montague. These are, and we went through those records for hours. I think the court heard 4 hours of testimony with Miss Montague on the stand, just recounting those medical records, that many of which she hadn't seen before, because they were in the custody and control of medical and behavioral health providers. Your Honor, these records are just a snapshot of Savannah's life at a moment in time, a very trying moment in time, where she had a lot of things going on in her life that made her stressed out and anxious and depressed, and she was beginning to act out on those feelings. And none of these records were from 2017. The last record I believe the court has of a hospitalization was June of 2016. Savannah moved to Missouri in August of 17 and died in July, almost a year later, in July of 17. August of 16 to July of 2017. So none of these records that you see were records that were generated while Savannah was under the care of the defendant. But even if these records were relevant to July of 2017 and her time with the defendant, Ms. Montague was asked on the stand if Savannah had a plan for suicide. She couldn't answer. And why is that? Savannah herself answered that question, Judge. You can look at Defendant's Exhibit E. There is an answer in that exhibit. She told her healthcare provider, "I just say I do to get help." And she followed up that statement with, "I really did not want to act on it," referring to a plan for suicide. Additionally, Your Honor, the defense introduced hundreds of pages of medical records and went over them with Miss Montague. And Miss Montague didn't see many of them. Didn't even know, couldn't tell you what they meant. Why is that? Well, Miss Montague's not an expert on psychiatry or psychology, and no expert testimony was provided to explain those medical records or those behavioral health records. You just have the observations made for and statements made for the purposes of medical treatment to healthcare providers in 2016. These medical records, these behavioral health records, essentially amount to three things. She came in for depression and dark thoughts, she was hospitalized twice, and she was discharged, each time with medication, and continued to receive therapeutic services. And again, these records were from times when Savannah was in Minnesota and Wisconsin, long before she moved to the defendant's house in Ozarks County, Missouri, where the defendant murdered her and then disposed of her body. In fact, you heard about her time in Missouri. You heard about Savannah's time in Missouri and how she was happy and healthy from multiple witnesses that actually interacted with her during her time in Missouri. Michael Williams, who was one of the first state's witnesses, He was a firefighter. You heard that that the defendant was a volunteer firefighter, and that they were familiar with Savannah. And Michael Williams told the court that Savannah was a happy kid. You heard from Robert P. Jr., the defendant's husband and boyfriend at the time that Savannah was alive. That she was happy, she was a hard worker, and thought that Savannah was acting normal on the night that she disappeared and was murdered by the defendant. Buddy Smart, defendant's ex-boyfriend, testified. He saw Savannah, he knew Savannah. She was a happy kid despite being told to roll around in a pig pen by the defendant. Despite being hosed down by the defendant. Despite being told to jump into a pond by the defendant. Miss Montague even testified that Savannah was excited to leave her home north of here to come 1,000 miles down to live in Missouri. Your Honor, more evidence of Savannah's happiness and being healthy here in Missouri was State's Exhibit 8, which was introduced to the court. What was State's Exhibit 8? That was a Mother's Day card sent in for Mother's Day of 2017, the last Mother's Day that Savannah and Miss Montague got to celebrate before the defendant murdered Savannah. The tone of the writing in that card is, again, happy and healthy. How do we know the defendant killed Savannah? Defendant destroyed the body. You know this from State's Exhibit number 17. That was the teeth and the jawbone recovered from the burn pile. There was barely anything left of Savannah Leckie. Enough to fit into a bag. That's how terrible the defendant's treatment of Savannah Leckie was. You know from State's Exhibit number 9, that was a stipulation entered into by the defense and the state regarding Dr. Eric Wilson, DDS. He's a forensic dentist, and he would have testified that he found no inconsistencies between the teeth and the known radiographs of Savannah. State's Exhibit number 3, we know from the defendant's own words that she destroyed the body. That she transported the body in a truck up the hill and put it into the burn pile and raked coals over it until it was gone. We know from witness Kathy Hilton that she destroyed the body because the defendant admitted to her that she burned the body after drugging Savannah. How do we know the defendant killed Savannah? Because the defendant concealed the death of Savannah. The defendant destroyed the body, as we previously mentioned and discussed. Now, we talked a little bit about defendant being a volunteer firefighter and a first responder. Presumably, as a first responder, one would know what to do with the body. And it's not throw it into a burn pile. It's called 911. It's to call somebody. It's called a coroner. It's called a sheriff. You're a first responder, a firefighter. You should know that. Defendant, on the morning of the 20th, calls law enforcement. And she claims, can't find Savannah. She must have run away. She's missing. Defendant knew where Savannah was. We know that from Defendant's Exhibit 3. She admitted to burning Savannah's body. She knew on the 20th where she was. She was in that burn pile reduced to a bag of bones. Defendant permitted a massive law enforcement search. You heard from the law enforcement officers and the firefighters. There were law enforcement officers from several agencies: Ozarks County Sheriff's Office, Baxter County, Arkansas Sheriff's Office, Highway Patrol, civilians, firefighters. Perhaps 100 people are out there on this 81-acre farm, scouring it, looking for Savannah, believing that Savannah had run away. Michael Williams, one of our first witnesses again, said that he had thought that Savannah had run away. That's what he was led to believe. We know that wasn't true, because defendant knew exactly where Savannah was, in the burn pile. And despite that, she never told law enforcement officers or volunteers that were looking for Savannah, that were wasting their time looking for Savannah, that Savannah was dead in that burn pile. The defendant led the public to believe that Savannah was still out there. Michael Williams again testified to the defendant lighting beacon fires. You heard about the beacon fires. That hopefully someone will see the beacon and come back. How could she see the beacon when she's dead in a burn pile? When the defendant placed her in the burn pile. So she led the public to believe that Savannah was still alive, despite knowing exactly where she was. I would point to State's Exhibit 31, which was introduced into evidence. I would ask the court be sure to read State's Exhibit 31. It's a thriller. State's Exhibit 31 is a 17-page rambling manifesto authored by the defendant. She points her fingers at everyone she can possibly name, including people that are thousands of miles away in Minnesota, as being involved in Savannah's disappearance, despite knowing where Savannah was in the burn pile, because she placed her there. She killed her and placed her there. And she says, you could consider me a suspect, but David and Tamile, they're going to use this runaway incident to take Savannah away from me. But she already killed Savannah, and she knows it. She already knows where Savannah is. Additionally, to show that the defendant concealed Savannah's death, State's Exhibits 17 and 18, the bones and the zipper pull. That's all that was left of Savannah. Not a body, not anything like that. 13 bone, 13 teeth, a jawbone, and a zipper pull. State's Exhibit 24 through 30, Your Honor. Those were numerous pictures of the burn pile where Savannah was located, including, they demonstrated how large this burn pile was. This burn pile was taller than the law enforcement officers. Law enforcement officers are standing on top of it, holding up a tape measure because they can't get to the top of it, measuring it. And it's stacked with both burned and fresh cedar. Going towards the defendant's concealment of Savannah's death, Your Honor, the defendant omitted the existence of the hydrocodone pills. She never mentioned it to law enforcement until confronted with it. Mr. Pete Jr. freely disclosed this information to law enforcement. One of the first things he mentions to, I believe it was Deputy Dobbs. He says that there are missing hydrocodone pills. And when confronted with that information, when the deputies asked the defendant about these missing hydrocodone pills, her response was, it would make her fear a reality. But her fear was already a reality because she bore that fear. She was the one that disposed of and killed Savannah. State's Exhibit 23, the marriage license. They get married. She gets married to Mr. Pete on the day the remains are located. And you heard testimony that they left during the search to go get married. That marriage license reflects that they got married on the day of the search. And we all know about the legal concept of marital privilege. Mr. Pete Jr. saw no visible injuries on Savannah when he saw her on the 18th and the 19th. And you heard this ridiculous story about how Savannah tried to throw herself into a fire and was injured, and she went out to the doctor to try to get pills for Savannah and not herself. And defendant goes and tells Robert Pete Sr., what are you supposed to do when your daughter runs into a fire? And you heard from the tape, the recording, that the defendant told the state public defender's office that Savannah ran towards the fire on the 18th, and that she had heroically tried to save her. But we know Savannah wasn't injured. We know she didn't try to run towards the fire. And she died, according to the defendant, from taking pills. That's the defendant's own statement. Well, we know there's a little bit more to that than Savannah taking pills on her own behalf and committing suicide. Defendant drugged Savannah. How do we know how the defendant killed Savannah? That the defendant killed Savannah? Because defendant drugged Savannah. We know that through this simple fact pattern, Judge. State's Exhibit 12, we had a stipulation agreed upon by the state and the defense that there was a hydrocodone prescription, that it was filled on the 19th and it was given to the defendant on the 19th. You heard from Jessica Wohlen, who testified that the defendant drugged Savannah with crushed pills and mixed them with Kool-Aid. Kathy Hilton, who has never met Jessica Wohlen, and you can look at the affidavits from the jails that were provided as exhibits to the court. You can look at those affidavits and see they provide the jail state information for each one of those women, and none of them line up. Kathy Hilton and Jessica Wohlen don't line up because they were in different jails. They had never met before in their entire life. Defendant never mentions the pills to law enforcement. Again, we know that, and she doesn't mention them until she's confronted with that information. And she already knew about the pills because she admits to them in State's Exhibit 3 in the recording. The Jailhouse Snitches, Your Honor, how do we know that the defendant killed Savannah? Because the Jailhouse Snitches are credible. Your Honor, I've been a prosecutor for 12 years, and crimes born in hell don't have angels for witnesses. All three of these witnesses did not have cases in Ozark County. They are not the best people in the world. They are felons. They freely admit that they are all convicted felons. But they have no reason to lie, Your Honor. They did not receive favorable treatment from the state. They did not receive favorable treatment from Ozark County because they didn't have cases in Ozark County. In fact, all three witnesses, Jessica and Sarah, did not receive any favorable treatment from Douglas County, which is where their charges were out of. In fact, Jessica Wohlen went to prison. She testified to that she went to prison for her charges. I believe it was drug trafficking. Kathy testified she didn't receive favorable treatment from the Christian County prosecutor, either as the Christian County prosecutor or the special prosecutor for Taney County, where she had charges. Kathy did not receive special treatment from the Greene County prosecutor. She testified to that. She testified that she pled guilty because she knew she was going to get probation because it was a stealing-related offense and her first offense. And she testified that she doesn't watch the news, that she said she was not in the place for watching the news, and she still doesn't watch the news, and has not followed this case. And that she did not hear about this case again until the state subpoenaed her to appear. That she went a couple of years. She was in jail with the defendant in 2018. And she went a few years before she received a subpoena in this case, and the court could look at its own record and see when a subpoena was returned. This case was initially charged by complaint, followed by a grand jury indictment with very limited details. Your Honor, the original indictment stated she was killed by unknown means. We had an argument about that prior to the beginning of trial with the substitute information that alleged more specificity that was accepted by this court on day one of trial. But the original charging document alleged that Savannah was killed by unknown means. Kathy Hilton recalls details that are not in the original charging document. She recalls a truck being used to transport Savannah. There's no mention of a truck in the charging document. We heard about a truck. We heard about the use of pills to drug Savannah. Well, how would she know about pills? Pills aren't in the charging document. But the defendant talked about pills. The defendant talked about pills to her lawyers. The defendant talked about pills to law enforcement. Not in the charging document. Not something Kathy Hilton would have known. Sheriff Ruud was asked by the defense when he was on the stand about specific media coverage, and nothing in his testimony about that media coverage mentioned anything about drugs or truck. And even though no evidence that lye was used, there's no evidence that lye was used to dispose of Savannah's body. Kathy knew lye was present. And how do we know lye was present? Joe Marcello confirmed it. He had a fear about the safety of his dogs around this property with all of this lye, about it getting into their nose, about it getting on their paws and injuring his dogs. How do we know the defendant killed Savannah? Because we know Robert Peete Jr. is credible. None of the evidence that we presented indicates Robert Peete Jr.'s involvement in the murder of Savannah. The defendant actually stated in her recording, her conversation with the Missouri State Public Defender, that you could set off a nuke under Peete Jr. and that he would not wake up. You can find that at page 14. The transcript, the approximate time is 13 minutes. The transcript indicates it's inaudible, but if you listen to it, it's nuke. And of course, the official exhibit is what governs, not the transcript. Mr. Peete himself testified that he's a heavy sleeper. The defendant said in her recording that Peete Jr. was not involved, and she felt bad for him because he relit the burn pile. The defendant knew full well what was in the burn pile, according to her own statements. That's at page 60 of State's Exhibit 3. Peete Jr., I would point out to the court, is a charged co-defendant. He is also before this court on the same charges. Testified in a first-degree murder case without the benefit of immunity under Section 491-205. He testified on his own free will and volition. How do we know defendant killed Savannah? Savannah did not die in the trailer. How do we know that? Joe Marcello. Joe Marcello testified about his dogs. They were brought out to the property and they extensively searched the camper trailer. In fact, the court asked Mr. Marcello about his search of the camper trailer. And Mr. Marcello testified that the dogs would have an alert, or they would have a noticeable, what he called a noticeable change of behavior on what he referred to as residual scent. Now, he testified that his personal experience with his dogs is that they will alert up to 1 year. But he's also done experiments with grave dirt, 12-year-old grave dirt, and he can put it under the ground, and the dogs will still pick up on it and still alert on it, that knowing that a dead body was in that. His dogs were able to alert to a dead body that was 20 feet underwater, just 30 minutes after falling underwater. He testified that his dogs can alert within minutes of death. Now, the court's question to Mr. Marcello was regarding the alerting the trailer. Joe went through that trailer. He talked about the bed in the trailer. He talked about going up and down the trailer. He talked about he was in there with a member of law enforcement. And the entire time Joe was in the trailer, the dogs never had a noticeable change of behavior. They did not alert from anything in the trailer, residual, scent, or otherwise. Defendant in State's Exhibit 3 stated that Savannah, on page 59 of the transcript from State's Exhibit 3, that Savannah was cold and not there when she found her. If she was cold and not there when she found her, the dog would have alerted. It did not. Why? Because she was killed in the fire. Like Joe Marcello said, it's like spaghetti in a white plastic bowl. It never goes away. Defendant, in her recording with her attorneys, stated that she talked to her doctor and found out that hydrocodone couldn't kill Savannah and that it would just make her really constipated. Even the state public defender didn't believe that nonsense. Why would you ask the doctor that? Did the doctor know she was dead? How do we know the defendant killed Savannah? The defendant's consciousness of guilt. We have all of these indicators of consciousness of guilt. Former Deputy Fox testified that the defendant urinated herself, and you saw a picture of that. Despite being told by numerous law enforcement officers, by email, in person, that she was free to go, that she did not have to stick around. And in fact, she did ultimately leave to go marry Mr. P. When she found, when there was increased activity on the hill, you heard Deputy Fox say you couldn't see what was going on the hill, but you could see there was increased activity headed that way. They were bringing more equipment, they were bringing more officers. That was where Savannah was found. And when that happened, when that activity increased, when that dog hit on the pile, she urinated herself. And then she goes on Facebook to make herself look like an innocent party, that she's being abused and mistreated by law enforcement. And State's Exhibit 32, which was introduced with Ms. Montague, was the defendant's Facebook, complaining that the deputies detained her and told her she couldn't leave and couldn't go anywhere, and that she peed herself and that her rights were violated. No, absolutely not. We know that's not true. State's Exhibit 33, that's an email between Deputy Dobbs and the defendant, recounting dreams about pills and dogs eating Savannah. Defendant 23, that's the marriage on the day Savannah was located. We know defendant went out and married Robert P. Jr. on August 1st, thinking marital privilege. Witnesses testified that they left. Remember, they were told, their story is that, our defendant's story is that, can't leave, I'm detained. I peed myself because they violated my rights. Despite everyone else saying she was told that she was free to leave. More evidence of consciousness of guilt, Your Honor. State's Exhibits 5, 6, and 7. Contemplating the potential charges, the availability of DNA evidence, the charger airplane mode phone off, found on her person at arrest before charges issued. In this case, defendant was arrested at the Greyhound bus station here in Springfield with a significant, what the deputy described as a significant amount of baggage. She's attempting to leave. She attempted to blame Ms. Montague for what happened to Savannah. We heard 4 hours of testimony from Ms. Montague, claiming that Ms. Montague was a terrible mother. I seriously doubt, Judge, that Ms. Montague would have wanted her daughter to die. You saw her reaction at the hands of the defendant. You saw her reaction when she was on the stand and she looked at the last Mother's Day card she got from Savannah and she broke down and cried. Ms. Montague didn't want her to die. The defendant sure did. During her transfer, another evidence of consciousness of guilt, Your Honor, during her transfer from Ozark County to Taney County, when this case was changed to venue to Ozark County, or from Taney County to Taney County, she tells Deputy Dobbs, she says, "Hey, Deputy Dobbs, can I ask you a question?" He says, "No, you're represented. I can't talk to you." She says, "Did they find my daughter?" Well, we know they found her daughter because she knows where her daughter was. And then she tells the defendant, she tells Deputy Dobbs, something evil up there happened on the hill. Yes, something evil happened up there on the hill. She killed her daughter and burned her in fire. She did not call 911 to report Savannah's alleged overdose. Again, the defendant is a volunteer firefighter. She would have known to call the police or 911 or somebody, not take her daughter in a truck and drive her up the hill and burn her in the fire. Finally, Your Honor, I'd point to the act of burning the body in the fire. She didn't bury the body. She wanted to get rid of that body. This isn't a mother having a panic and grieving over her daughter's body and putting it somewhere on this 81-acre farm where she could have buried it and made a little gravestone or whatever. She destroyed the evidence down to bone fragments, teeth, and a zipper pull. Your Honor, at the conclusion, after all of that evidence, the only reasonable conclusion one can come to and meet is that the defendant, Ms. Ruud, killed Savannah Frances Lee Leckie. That she did so after deliberation, that's first-degree murder. You have to do it after deliberation. That's cool reflection on the matter by throwing her into a fire after she poisoned her. And we know from Kathy Hilton that when she didn't die in the fire, she beat her until she was dead. She tampered with evidence. She took numerous steps to hide her activities from law enforcement. The manifesto, that she must have run away, let's search the 81-acre farm, let's have hundreds of people search. Despite knowing exactly where she was the entire time. And finally, she knew where Savannah's remains were located, and she failed to report that to law enforcement. And I will ask the court to return a verdict of guilty as to murder in the first degree, guilty as to tampering with evidence, and guilty as to abandonment of a corpse. Thank you, Your Honor.
Your Honor, this has, since the case was actually filed and began, it's been an odd case. It's an odd set of facts. The people involved, it's an odd situation. And frankly, the other thing that makes it odd was just the manner in which it was investigated. I'll start and talk a little bit about Ms. Ruud, about Reba herself. Reba did come from a strange background. What we did hear from Tamile, and also in the 17-page statement that the state's called the manifesto, that she was raised from an abusive mother, and that she had given birth to 4 children, but she did not raise any of those 4 children herself. That had everything to do with she didn't want to be like her mother. She allowed other people to raise her children, and 2 of those children were raised by Tamile Montague. Tamile kept Reba involved. It was an open adoption. There were no secrets about who Reba was, that Reba was the biological mother, but that Tamile and David adopted the kids, and that Reba felt that they would be able to give the kids a better life. Reba herself, too, with her choice of profession, which truck driver. It is somewhat unusual to have a female truck driver. She was working at the Isabella concrete plant and worked just like a man, as one of the firefighters would have testified. She was self-reliant, independent, and was not a stranger to hard labor or hard work. Whenever in Ozark County, her farm was off-grid. It was 81 acres. You had to go off a county road and then another county road, I believe as the state described it, as deepest, darkest Ozark County. And there was no electricity running up there. But there was a building. The building was not insulated. It was essentially a metal pole barn that had been roughed in for a future apartment. But it was not insulated. There was no air conditioning. There was a wood stove for heat. It had actually bathroom fixtures and things like that, but this was very much off-grid. You did have to run a generator in order to charge batteries to have electric or to fill the well tank so that you would have running water. And Ms. Ruud was finally off-grid. She had goats, and she was just trying to have a country life. During this time, whenever Ms. Ruud had finally kind of fulfilled a dream job and had her property, and she did own it in tandem with her partner Elmer Guthrie, was one of the times whenever Savannah happened to have some hard times and had this mental health issue and things like that. Reba was aware of some of it, not maybe to the extent of Tamile, who was present during these times whenever Savannah was seen by health professionals or in the partial hospitalization program or whenever she was fully in inpatient treatment. But Reba, it was no secret from Reba that these things were happening. And that comes back to she had a great relationship with Tamile. Tamile thought highly of Reba, thought highly enough of Reba that she thought that her daughter, her adopted daughter, could go live with Reba, and Reba would help take care of these behavior problems, that they could reset some of those behaviors, is what I believe Tamile testified to. Tamile also testified that Reba referred to her as mom as well. They were close. They shared family holidays. They lived together for periods of time. And Reba was involved in her daughter's lives. And when I say her, I do mean both Reba and Tamile, because when they were together, I think they considered each other co-parents. Reba wasn't a stranger, neither to Tamile nor to her daughters. Reba also was aware that Savannah had been diagnosed with autism and with ADHD. When we come to the time around 2015, 2016, 2017, we have a few things going on. Savannah was born in 2001, so she's 14. She's a young teenager, an adolescent. That's one thing that happens, and there's just changes that happen with every teenager during that time. But there were also some significant changes happening with Tamile and with the home life. And that had to do with ending a relationship with a stepdad, Mike Evans, and then Tamile starting a new relationship with Carrie Steves. Tamile testified that she felt the problem was that she was too happy. I think the court, I think any of us could take that in multiple ways. She stated that there had been a falling out with Reba over some things that Carrie Steves had posted on Facebook. And the concern from Reba was that Savannah was a Facebook friend and would have seen this adult-natured post on her future stepfather's page. And that caused Tamile to cut Reba off. Why do I tell the court that or remind the court that? It wasn't over. Reba's concern was for Savannah during that. It wasn't for Tamile's feelings, it wasn't for Carrie's feelings, it wasn't for her own. She called Tamile out on what she felt like was a bad act of parenting Savannah, and it caused Tamile to cut Reba off for a period of time. Reba was concerned about Savannah. Savannah herself, Tamile testified that the Asperger's, or being on the higher functioning end of the autism spectrum, caused Savannah to have some issues. She was socially awkward. She was emotionally immature. She maybe was impulsive or destructive and emotionally immature. She acted younger than her actual appearing age. Some of the other things about Savannah, some of the wonderful things about Savannah is that she was brilliant. She was a sponge for information. The autism would make her share it sometimes or overshare it with people too, that as part of the social awkwardness. But certainly Savannah, when we talk about disabilities, we aren't talking about someone who was physically disabled. We had Buddy Smart testify, and Robert Pete Jr. was able to testify that Savannah was certainly physically able, to do things. That there was certainly, the disability was a behavioral health issue only. In 2015, the specific conflict at home was conflict with Mike Evans. That Savannah had made some accusations that Mike had mistreated her, that she was seen by multiple providers, and that's when this diagnosis of depression starts to appear in those medical records. Her performance at school got worse. And in May of 2015, She was placed in a partial home hospitalization at Prairie Care due to suicidal ideation. She expressed at that time that she had a plan to hang herself, that there were dark writings and there were internet searches that caused both the school counselor and her mother, Tamile, concern. She was on medication at that time. Mr. Brown indicated then in his closing that there were additional notes in there that Savannah had made statements that she wasn't serious or she didn't really plan to go through it. But I would submit to the court, these are documented in medical records. Medical health professionals took it seriously enough to note it and to place her in a program where it was treated. So to suggest then that Savannah was somehow making it up, Tamile took it seriously enough to get her to a hospital. The people at the hospital took it seriously enough to address it and put it in notes and treat her for it. So I think that the argument that this suicidal threat was fake or contrived is frankly offensive. It was taken very seriously by the people who were there and heard it. After she was discharged from the PHP, or the partial hospitalization program, she started attending counseling through Solutions Counseling. And Tamile, her mother, attended most of those sessions. And again, the diagnoses listed at that time included ADHD, autism, oppositional defiant disorder, and major depressive disorder. There was also discussion that Savannah, at that time, in July of 2015, could possibly have borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder. There were changes taking place in Savannah that were recognized by the professionally trained person and people who were treating her and counseling her for these issues. Also within the Solutions Counseling notes, Savannah had developed a suicide plan, and Tamile had stated that it was family conflict that had caused these ups and downs in Savannah. And Tamile also discussed within those notes that Savannah had become disagreeable and defiant. Also, that one of Savannah's friends had been successful in committing suicide. When we get to February of 2016, Savannah is evaluated again at Prairie Care. And in that time, Savannah stated that she thought daily of suicide. And she was engaged in self-harm and cutting at that time as well. If we go a few months forward, in June of 2016, Savannah ended up in inpatient treatment. It was not partial home hospitalization, it was truly inpatient. And this was the time where her counselor and Tamile were so concerned with the things that she had said and the rapid decline, as Tamile in those notes, that was a quote, the rapid decline in behavior, that led to her ride in an ambulance from her counselor's office to the emergency department, where she was evaluated at the emergency department, and they sent her to an adolescent inpatient behavioral health bed, and she was held there for several days. And again, in June of 2016, Savannah reported daily thoughts of suicide with self-harm and cutting. And within those notes, Savannah had told Tamile that she would commit suicide, if not today, then she would before the end of the summer. Her depression had increased dramatically. Tamile actually told the staff at the emergency department, "I will have a dead child if she goes home today." I know Mr. Brown noted that I was reading from the records, but I'm sure the court would recall that Tamile was certainly a hostile witness. And I did not read things that Tamile was not present for. Tamile, the things I read to Tamile and asked her to answer, she should have been present for and she should have known. Also, as the person who was administering the medications at home, she should have known. And if the state had a problem with it, they could have objected. In all of these instances, Savannah was discharged with medications to take. And Tamile testified that they were taken as prescribed. But when she was discharged from Abbott Northwest in 2016, in those notes, it talks about additional medications and that she had been on Abilify, and she was discharged with risperidone, which is an antipsychotic drug. Yesterday...
Your Honor, objection, facts on evidence.
I mean, the fact is an evidence that there was such a prescription.
Right, but not what that prescription,
It's in the record.
what kind of prescription that is.
Okay, it's closing argument.
Thank you.
Tamile had also advised hospital staff that she was concerned because Savannah was living in an alternate reality and there had been a rapid decline in her condition. Despite all of this, well, I'll just again note that Mr. Brown, I think, wants the court to think that Savannah wasn't very serious and that no one really took this seriously and was just trying to get attention, or whatever reason that Savannah was making these statements. I would submit that there was someone who was not taking this seriously. Savannah was hospitalized on June 10th of 2016, hospitalized in Minnesota, and Tamile testified that on June 10th of 2016, she was not in Minnesota. She was not caring for her daughter at that time. She was in Las Vegas becoming engaged to her new boyfriend on that date. Within those notes too, Savannah told the hospital staff that it would be impossible for her to go home on June 10th because her mother was in Las Vegas with her boyfriend. Savannah was quite aware of where her mother was at that time. After Savannah is discharged in June of 2016, Savannah bounces around. She bounces to her aunt Amanda. She bounces to a camp. And then she bounces out to Montana to stay with Tamile's parents for a period of time. Somewhere during that time, the decision is made that neither Amanda, the aunt, the parents, Tamile's parents, I'll clarify, are not the right place for Savannah to go, nor is the adoptive father, David Leckie, the right place to go. Instead, Tamile thinks that we'll send Savannah to get these behaviors under control. We'll send her 14 hours away to Ozark County, Missouri. And she does so after Savannah, without any sort of doctor's directive, has been weaned off of these medications. Additionally, whenever Reba came to pick up Savannah in August of 2016, there was no power of attorney at that time. There was no medical card sent. There were no prescriptions. There was nothing sent like that. She sent a child who had been hospitalized 2 months prior for a suicidal ideation to Missouri without any medications or the ability to get any. That's how these behaviors were going to be placed under control. A power of attorney from Tamile didn't come until January of 2017. Tamile was not the only person who had legal custody over Savannah. There was another parent, and that parent had not signed it in January of 2017. Reba, and also Savannah's medical coverage through the state of Minnesota had expired at the end of December 2016. Regardless, so Savannah was uninsured as of January 1st, 2017, and she was 14 hours away from the people that could legally take her to seek medical treatment. The other thing, considering that if the best place for Savannah at that point was in fact Reba, she was also 14 hours from her siblings, from her aunts, from her grandparents, from her dad. She was 14 hours from the medical staff that was familiar with her treatment, that knew her issues. She didn't have a counselor. She didn't have any counseling sessions when she was in Missouri. It just abruptly stopped. She didn't have her medications. She didn't have her peers. The way to get these behaviors under control was to send her someplace where she had nothing. And not only did Savannah have nothing, she did not equip the adult that she was entrusting with her child the ability to seek that help. Tamile knew what Reba's profession was, that she was a truck driver and did primarily hard labor type of things. Tamile knew that it was difficult to parent Savannah and work full-time whenever there was a two-parent household. She applied for the waiver for the personal care assistant based on that she could only work part-time, even though it was a two-parent household, because of the time it took to parent Savannah. And that doesn't make Savannah a bad kid, a bad person. It makes Savannah a child that has those two, the disabilities. There were quite a few people, I think, who let Savannah down in this situation. Reba was not one of them. Tamile testified that Reba kept in contact with her about discipline, and that Tamile, with what she knew, did not have any sort of issues or concerns with Reba. She also testified that she did not go to Missouri. There were times that had been discussed or planned, but if Tamile had any concerns, she had legal custody of Savannah. She could have pulled her back at any point, could have gone to pick her up, could have arranged for her to be taken up to Minnesota, but that didn't happen because she didn't have any concerns. The state talks about and suggests that Savannah was not suicidal in 2017. Well, unlike whenever Savannah was in Minnesota and was being seen for the suicidal ideations, there was legal authority to take her to a doctor. There could be medical records introduced and created during that time because Tamile had insurance and she also was the legal parent. Reba did not have that luxury. One of the things in the medical records is that whenever Savannah's behaviors began to increase, she would start to isolate. She would be upset. Tamile also talks about a rapid decline. Mr. Brown suggested that during the time of July of 2017, Savannah wasn't suicidal. Whenever the firefighters arrived, I'll back up a step here. The firefighters had testified that they all knew Savannah. They'd seen her because this was the Theodosia area volunteer fire department. And Savannah was a junior firefighter. Reba was on the board. They knew Savannah. They did express surprise that Savannah wasn't out there to see them at the fire. But we have, from Reba's recorded statement, she says that Savannah had gotten burned in a fire earlier. And she said that she had attempted to jump into or throw herself into the fire. Recall that this is not a neurotypical child. This is someone who suffers from ADHD. This is someone who's emotionally immature, who is impulsive. This is someone who's on the autism spectrum. And from Reba's statement, that is when her burn occurred, because she caught Savannah and was pulling her back out. Robert Pete Jr. talks about how that evening Savannah and Reba seemed to be having a very serious discussion, and he thought it was about homework. We also heard that Reba was trying to protect Robert. If Reba was being untruthful about something, it maybe was a white lie to Robert to try to not involve him in this very serious problem that she was having with Savannah. When we talk about The firefighters then saying it was odd that Savannah wasn't out there, and Reba said she's in the camper trying to cool off. Again, the cooling off thing could have been a white lie from that point at Reba, but Savannah was in the camper. Savannah was burned, and Savannah was in one of these rapid declines. And Savannah was in the camper, and Reba was trying to shield her from that. They also note that Reba was acting odd. Think of this, it was extremely hot. A fire had gotten out of control. Reba was injured, and Reba told the firefighters it had to do with the wood splitter. There was a wood splitter up on the hill, but in reality, it had happened with Savannah. And she was trying to protect Savannah from having to face some of those things there, and also to try to figure out what to do. And Your Honor, I think that's every bit as plausible as anything that the state has tried to present here. And it's actually supported. It's actually supported by the witnesses. It's actually supported by Ms. Ruud's own statement. And Mr. Brown talks about the evidence that was presented in this case to support murder or child abuse resulting in death with felony murder attached to that, which now, as he stated, has gone from unknown means to by burning or drugging. So let's walk through some of the evidence here. Whenever Sheriff Reed testified, again, one of my first statements was that it was the investigation itself was odd. And Sheriff Reed exemplified that. I do not doubt that he is a religious man. I do not doubt that this particular case and many others were emotional for him and bothered him. But Sheriff Reed, rather than pointing to evidence, kept pointing to thoughts and feelings and what he felt were messages. It was not supported by evidence. That's odd. This investigation has been characterized by they reached a conclusion first, and we're trying to build evidence or support it with evidence that doesn't match. The biggest issue that I would bring up with Sheriff Reed was his testimony that he was the one on the hill who saw the dog coming up, and the dog signaled for him, and they had a moment where they stared at each other, and what he then realized later was the dog signaling before it bound off, and then he used his walking stick to find a bone in the ashes. It's just not true. Joe Marcillo, whenever he was on the stand, he testified the dogs were never out of his sight. And the dogs certainly alerted on the burn pile. And frankly, that's what, based on Ms. Ruud's statement, I think what we all expected. That's exactly where the dogs should have alerted. But Sheriff Reed was nowhere near there. It was actually a separate officer, Warren Wiedemann, who suggested to Mr. Marcillo that that would be a good place to send in the dog. And the dog did alert. Again, it goes exactly with what Reba said in her reporting. Mr. Brown indicated that the dog's failure to alert on anything within the camper would indicate that Savannah was murdered. That's a stretch. That's a significant stretch. What Mr. Marcillo did testify to is that he is a handler of the human detection or human remains detection dogs. He's not a scholar on the exact science of the human remains detection dogs. He knows his dogs will smell things. He knows they're typically accurate, but he doesn't know the exact chemicals. He gave several anecdotal stories, one of which he said that the quickest one of his dogs had ever detected was within a 30-minute time period. However, that was significantly different in different circumstances. In that anecdotal story, that person was under 22 feet of water, and it was with a different dog and with different certifications. Although he couldn't explain about the science of this, he couldn't explain exactly about the science of the smell, and he did state that the dogs did not alert in the camper, but he also did not say that it was impossible for the dogs, that the dog's failure to alert within the camper meant any particular conclusion. What we're missing here, and again, law enforcement had an opportunity to go through there, and law enforcement stated they had been through the camper. Mr. Marcello stated that whenever he was in there on August 4th of 2017, that the camper was in disarray. It was messy, that there was a mountain of clothing piled on what he thought was a bed. What we know from Ms. Ruud's recording is that she stated she found Savannah dead in the camper and was in bed, but that whenever she moved Savannah's body, she took the bedding around from that. We don't have any evidence of the condition, whether it was a before or after. We don't know how law enforcement found the mattress. We don't even know that there was necessarily a mattress or that it was the same one in there. There are other plausible reasons here as to why a dog wouldn't have detected in that camper other than Savannah was murdered by some other means. She could have died in that camper. We simply don't have enough to completely exclude it, which is similar to what, frankly, there was misstated evidence, and the officers seemed to think that the bones and the examination of the teeth meant that Savannah had 100% been identified, when in reality, and what the stipulation would say, is essentially Savannah could not be excluded as a possibility. Obviously, that becomes less important once Ms. Ruud's recording comes into play. I understand that the identification isn't the primary issue here. But some of the other anecdotes that Joe Marcello gave was that he spoke of how blood, if it was on a plastic tub, even if it was rinsed, would still give an odor. According to Ms. Ruud's version in the recording, there's no blood. Savannah was simply lying in bed. Mr. Marcello also provided information that whenever he was an emergency medical technician, that whenever, I believe he stated that he witnessed decomposition. I don't think that that was necessarily an accurate thing for him to have stated, but that whenever he watched someone pass away, and that they almost instantly turned cold, waxy, and sticky. That was instantaneous. We can't determine how quickly Savannah died in the trailer or in the camper. It may have been a few minutes after death, it could have been 10 minutes, it could have been more than that. But regardless, what Mr. Marcello could testify to is that his dog found the detected human remains on the hill, which is still consistent with Ms. Ruud's reporting. There are several other reasons as to why the dog may not have alerted in that camper. The state also wants to suggest that when Ms. Ruud urinated herself and then posted it on Facebook, that the only reason that could have happened was because she urinated herself out of fear. I would ask the court to recall that law enforcement, this was during the dog search, and that law enforcement had advised both she and Mr. Pete Jr. to stay out of the area where the dogs had been searching. The dogs had searched in the shop. They weren't in the shop at that time, but they had been advised to stay out of the dog's way and out of the areas that had been searched. The bathroom facilities were also contained in the shop. Mr. Brown also brings up the fact that Reba had stated to Deputy Dobbs that she had dreams or visions and that her fear would become a reality. I would just ask the court to consider, how was that any different from Sheriff Reed's thoughts or dreams and visions? It was the exact same thing. The state also notes that whenever she was stopped at the bus station in Springfield, that there were some personal notes in her luggage. She wasn't arrested until, I believe it was August 21st of 2017. She had already met with attorney staff, and that they had discussions about potential charges and other legal matters. The things that were found within her notes regarding potential charges and things like that, or DNA, she took notes. She took notes whenever she was at her attorney's office, and she kept those notes with her because she obviously was concerned about the investigation. But let's get to what the state really wants the court to contemplate and really consider as solid evidence, and that would be the jailhouse snitches. There were 3 jailhouse snitches from 2 different facilities. Jessica Wohlen was the first one that testified yesterday, and she testified yesterday that Reba had told her that she had drugged her daughter and the drugs had been placed in Kool-Aid. But she also wrote a statement on September 1st of 2017. That wasn't included in there. She kept reminding everyone and trying to state, even though she wasn't asked, that she had wrote it in her statement that she had asked to speak with law enforcement. No law enforcement testified that they ever spoke with her. She also said that she didn't get any consideration from the state in exchange for making that statement or agreeing to testify, but she sure asked for it. And she wrote a letter, and she put another snitch's name on there, and that snitch, Sarah Johnson, said that she wasn't aware, she never signed the letter. Jessica Wohlen also indicated that information, especially during that time when this had been very newly charged, that was the talk of the jail. That was the talk of Ozark County, and that everyone was talking about that. And there was the tremendous amount of media coverage at that time as well. The second snitch that the state put on was Sarah Johnson. She wrote a statement on the same day as Jessica Wohlen, but she stated yesterday that she didn't sign it, even though her name appears underneath Jessica Wohlen on the second letter. And in that, they were asking for some sort of consideration. And whichever one wrote the letter, characterized themselves as the state's best witnesses. Sarah Johnson also advised that her charges were dropped in exchange, or not, that was incorrect, were dropped, not necessarily in exchange for anything from the state regarding that statement, but that they were dropped. And those charges, at least one of them, was hindering prosecution of a felony. And then we come to Kathy Hilton. Kathy Hilton is the only witness that claims to have the full story of what happened to Savannah. She testified that she was raised right and raised to be truthful. And of course, she also revealed that she has convictions for forgery, for felony stealing. She has a conviction for delivery of controlled substance into a county jail, and that she also wanted to do right by children, but she does have 2 prior convictions for criminal non-support of a child. Beyond all of that, Kathy's story is virtually impossible to believe. And that's simply because on opportunity. She arrived in the jail on May 19th of 2018. On May 20th of 2018, she was searched and she was found to have drugs in her possession in the county jail. We heard testimony then that she was immediately placed on lockdown. We heard testimony from Amy Macbeth that typically an inmate that brings a controlled substance into the Taney County Jail would receive 20 days of lockdown. There's also a stipulation from the jail administrator that 20 days would be the standard time. However, neither Amy Macbeth nor the jail itself has a specific record as to the number of days that Kathy Hilton actually spent in lockdown in the Taney County Jail during that time. More importantly, Kathy Hilton herself couldn't recall how many days she spent in lockdown in the Taney County Jail. But what she could recall is that right after she got there, that she and Reba became fast friends, and that they were braiding each other's hair and telling each other stories. Amy Macbeth testified that when an inmate is placed in lockdown, they are placed in a cell, and those cells are solid doors. They're not barred doors. It would be difficult both to speak, that you can hear, but you would have to speak loudly in order to be heard through that door. There's also only either a beanhole or a chuck hole in those doors. I've never tried to do it myself, but I would say that it would be hard to braid hair through a beanhole or a chuck hole or a solid door. She also put in her written statement at that time that Reba told her that the burns on her arm were from when lye splashed on her, whenever she was trying to dissolve Savannah's bones to hide them. That is simply not true. We have a stipulation that Dr. Jeffrey Litt examined photographs of Reba's burns soon after they happened, and he determined from what evidence he was able to review, both medical records and the photographs, that they were thermal burns and not chemical. That also discredits Kathy Hilton's story. And finally, Kathy Hilton says that Reba told her that she hit her daughter after she woke up from being drugged in the fire, hit her in the head with a rake until she was dead. That is not supported by evidence either. The state did find and sent to the lab 2 garden tools, 2 rakes, and there are stipulations that they were tested by the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and neither fingerprints nor blood were located on either of those tools. What we can believe about Kathy Hilton is that she was in jail for a day, not even 24 hours before she was placed on lockdown for bringing drugs into the jail. This happened in May of 2018, and Reba had been in custody since August 21st of 2017. It makes no sense that suddenly, within this short amount of time, that Kathy Hilton and Reba would become such close and fast friends and braid each other's hair, that Reba would sit down and simply recount all of the details of a traumatic event and of her charge to a perfect stranger. It also makes no sense that Reba would have stood outside the door and shouted a confession through. Everyone would have heard. There would have been multiple people coming forward with this story if that was the case. And again, while neither Amy Macbeth nor Kevin Gwynn with the Taney County Jail could testify with certainty that Kathy Hilton would have spent 20 days in lockdown, we still have the issue of just the time period. If she came into the jail on May 19th and then was placed on lockdown on May 20th, Kathy Hilton wrote this statement and spoke with police on June 5th of 2018. From May 20th to June 5th, that's 17 days. If we assume that she had been in lockdown for the full length of time, that's still incorrect. That's still impossible. That's still less than 20 days, and she still would have been in lockdown and would have utterly lacked the opportunity to have done what she says she did. The state kind of posits the question of why. Why would Reba destroy Savannah's body if nothing sinister or nothing bad happened there? And I would posit the question, why? Why would she murder Savannah? What was going so wrong there that she would have progressed suddenly to murder? One of the reasons that makes me wonder why is that in June of 2017, Reba and Tamile were discussing about another power of attorney that would permit Reba to return to over-the-road truck driving and allow Savannah to accompany her. Reba was willing to include her in her life and in her profession and to take care of her. Reba was willing to make concessions and to make changes that would include Savannah. The state also was trying to introduce some sort of evidence of abuse of a child in this case. And they tried to do so with Buddy Smart. What Buddy did testify to is that he had witnessed Reba use a hose to clean Savannah down. You heard Tamile talk about the hygiene issues that Savannah had. It's located within the medical records. There were times when Savannah went into her group therapy classes, either during the partial hospitalization period or when she was inpatient hospitalized, where the staff notes there's a strong odor or she appears unkempt. Hygiene was an ongoing issue. And again, that using a hose on someone without some sort of additional facts that can be testified to is not in and of itself abuse. They had Buddy testify about the pond incident, and we heard that Savannah had been wanting to jump in the pond, that it wasn't something where she went kicking and screaming. It wasn't something where she was dragged or forcibly pushed into the pond. It also wasn't a day where it was sub-zero temperatures or something where it was truly an inhuman condition. It was something where just, okay, go get in the pond. Go wash yourself off that way, which then led to her coming back and being actually showered in the warmth and being given clothing. She wasn't deprived of clothing or the ability to wash with soap at that point. They were trying to get a point across to her. Even if that would be considered abuse, it's remote in time. Buddy left. Their relationship ended in March of 2017. And the state is alleging that the abuse would have been by burning or drugging, resulting in death. And being hosed down is not burning or drugging. Being placed into a pond or being told to go wade into a pond or dunk into a pond is neither burning nor drugging. And if this hawk pen thing actually happened, that's neither burning nor drugging, and it's remote in time. But he also testified that it had been a few months since there had been pigs, and we aren't talking like it was a concentrated swine operation. We are talking this had a couple of young pigs that were being grown to slaughter weight, and that they were gone before Savannah even got there. Again, very arguably not abuse. Kids who live on farms, she was in the goat pens and she was doing chores with livestock and she was handling goats and presumably cleaning their pens and handling their excrement, crawling through an abandoned pig pen without any pigs in there. I would submit, how is that any different from having a farm kid go clean a stall? It's about the same level of dirt. And regardless, it's remote in time, and it has nothing to do with burning or drugging. We also talk about the lie being present. Absolutely it was, but that was because Reba and Savannah were starting to make soap, and they had a website for a soap business. And they were making soap together, and Savannah was very excited about it. If we get back to the, well, why? Why did Reba then say that she burned Savannah's body? Again, here was a woman who was sent a child that her adopted mother, her legal mother, knew had been suffering from serious mental health issues, but was sent to Missouri without any ability to obtain, without medical insurance, without the ability to seek medical care, without medications, without counseling, without anything. And she had no legal rights to have this. It was a weird situation from the get-go. An adopted mother sent the child back to biological mother. It's an odd set of facts, as I said at the beginning. There had been a tremendous amount of stress happen within that 48-hour period. It was hot. They weren't in a climate-controlled environment. Reba had been injured. Reba says that Savannah had been injured, and that there had been a threat of suicide, that Savannah had tried to throw herself into the fire. The fire had gotten out of control. Reba had to contact the fire department, and she knew the fire department members as friends and colleagues out to help her. And this is a self-reliant, independent person. There was a lot going on during that short amount of time. And when it was all said and done, and whenever she found Savannah, it wasn't a good choice. It wasn't the smartest choice. It wasn't a logical choice, but it's what happened. And Reba, in the recording herself, had said that Savannah was upset with Tamile, was upset with David, because neither of them, for whatever reason, the reason doesn't matter, they had not been to see her. It had been a long time since she had seen either of her parents or her siblings. And the person who was taking care of her and who was caring about her had just been injured as a result of Savannah's actions. And whether that contributed to a rapid decline and a suicide attempt and a successful suicide, that's every bit as plausible as Reba murdering her. There's no motive here. The evidence of murder that the state wants to present is that the destruction of the body must mean murder. There's a whole lot of other reasons as to why Savannah ended up dying. And unlike the state, ours is supported by medical evidence, by Tamile's testimony saying that yes, she was aware that Savannah was suicidal, and that she took it seriously enough to seek medical treatment and hospitalization. It's a stretch, and it certainly goes against everything that we as lawyers learn in law school. We learn that we have to lay foundations, that we can't just jump to certain things, that simply because someone says, well, this must have been a murder, there has to be more. There has to be more evidence to support the actual murder. What the state does have, the state has evidence to show that they're for abandonment of a corpse. The state can absolutely prove that Reba burned Savannah's body. But that's all they can prove. They've presented no credible evidence of anything relating to a murder. There's far more evidence, not just thoughts and feelings, relating to the other possibility, which is that Savannah took her own life. Reba's response to it was not the lawful one. It certainly was not. But that does not mean that Rebecca Ruud either committed first-degree murder or committed child abuse resulting in murder, or child abuse resulting in death, excuse me. Thank you.
Brown?
Your Honor, defendant always wants to play the victim. Tamile would take Savannah away from her. Everybody wanted to take Savannah away from her. You can see that in the manifesto. She points the fingers at everyone except herself. She is the victim of incompetent and overzealous law enforcement. And on August 4th, when they discovered Savannah's remains, she peed herself because of that overzealous and incompetent law enforcement, telling her she was detained when she really wasn't. She wants to play the victim. And today, we're seeing it once again. She wants to lay the death of Savannah at the feet of others. Miss Montague, and even Savannah herself. The defendant, from the manifesto, Your Honor, the defendant liked to make children. She liked to take care of them. We know this from the state's, from that evidence. She didn't want to raise children. She got rid of, did this at least 4 times. She made children, abandoned them. Savannah was abandoned 2 days after she was born by the defendant. And then she left others to care for them. She did not know how to be a mother. And she took that out on Savannah. Now, Ms. Wellborn wants to make a big deal out of Sheriff Reed's testimony and him having a vision or believing that he would find Savannah's remains there. But the fact remains, the remains were found in the burn pile that Sheriff Reed said they were searching in, and that Joe Marcello said they were searching in. Your Honor, I would point to, there's a lot made of the defendant's, of Savannah's plans, suicide plan, cutting, hanging, suffocation. There's never a documented plan involving drugs. There was never a documented plan involving fire. And I think it's very offensive, Your Honor, that Ms. Wellborn thinks I'm making it up or making light of it. I've had friends and family that were depressed. I've gone through that. I've seen it. Mental health professionals. I'm not a mental health expert. I'm not a behavioral health expert. Ms. Wellborn is not a behavioral health expert. Mental health professionals took this seriously, and that is evident from the mental health records. They gave her treatment. They gave her help. She said she needed help, and that's why she was there. But she also said to those same mental health professionals, I'm not planning on acting on it because I'm here and I need help. And she got it. This information didn't come from Ms. Montague. It came from Savannah. She was the one saying she needed help. And again, there has been no explanation of any of these records. We've read the records. We have the records and evidence. We don't know what they mean. We don't know what the diagnoses mean. We don't know the significance of the diagnoses. The defense would have you believe that that is indicative of her committing suicide in July of 2017, when that is not the case. Again, that's almost a full year. That's over a full year from the June hospitalization. We went from June 16 to July 17. And in between that time, the only evidence that this court heard was that in her time in Missouri, from August to her death in July of 17, was that she was happy and healthy. I would also posit, Judge, that if you look at Defendant's Exhibit E, you'll actually see that Savannah complains the medications that these professionals are making her take and that her mom is administering to her aren't working. They're just not working, and she doesn't like taking them. I think Ms. Montague testified on the stand that she told medical providers that Savannah was someone that was subject to victimization because of her condition. She sure was victimized. She was victimized by the defendant, Ruud. We keep hearing the defense wanting to make this case about Ms. Montague. This case is not about Ms. Montague. Ms. Montague, I'm sure, regrets some of the decisions that she made as a mother because her daughter is now dead. She loved her daughter very much. This case is about the defendant murdering Savannah. And speaking about Ms. Montague, she's not a behavioral health expert either. She didn't know what was in those records, had to be refreshed as to what she said to those providers. And when Ms. Montague saw her daughter's behavior becoming worrisome. She got her help. She brought her to professionals. Ms. Montague's not a behavioral health professional. When they became worrisome to the defendant made her go through a hog pen. The defendant hosed her down outside. The defendant made her jump in a pond. The defendant took away her guinea pigs. You heard that from Buddy Smart. The defendant took away her guinea pigs. This is indicative of a total disregard for humanity, for empathy, and compassion. The defendant is a possessed evil person with evil intent. Let's talk about Joe Marcello. Joe Marcello, the defense mentioned that there are other plausible reasons why a dog would not be detected in the trailer. You didn't hear any of those plausible reasons. They didn't ask him about those plausible reasons. Ms. Wellborn certainly didn't provide it, but Joe Marcello told us why the dog didn't alert the trailer, and that's because there wasn't a dead body there. That's what he said. He's just the dog guy. He doesn't know the chemicals. He doesn't know the science, but he does know how his dogs operate. He does know he has so many dogs. He's certified as an examiner or an assessor, and he doesn't need to know the science. You don't need to know the science about how this phone works. It works. We know how it works. He knows how his dogs work. And he was able to testify to that. And he told you that his dogs did not alert the camper trailer, and that means there wasn't a dead body there. That means Savannah was not killed in the trailer. She was not killed by means of suicide, by drugging herself. You heard that the defendant peed herself because she couldn't go to the bathroom because they were in the shop and they were told to stay out of the shop. She's a farm girl, Judge. Hard-working farm girl on an 81-acre farm. She never told law enforcement that she needed to go to the bathroom. She just peed herself when they found the bones, when they found the remains of Savannah. You know, the funny thing about defendant's thoughts and dreams and visions and Sheriff Reed's thoughts and dreams and visions, they both turned out to be true. They both turned out to be Savannah dying and being reduced to bones and ash. The snitches, Your Honor, we heard from Jessica that the defendant drugged her daughter and placed those drugs in the cooler. She didn't put it in her written statement, but she said at the end of her written statement, "I have more information for you." And she gave that information. She was interviewed. There may have been tremendous media coverage in this case, but there's nothing in the record that shows public knowledge about the pills. Again, this case was charged by indictment. She was originally charged by Savannah dying of unknown means, by being murdered by unknown means. There was nothing introduced that suggested pills in the media coverage. Jessica Johnson's charges were dropped during prosecution. That's not evidence. She talked about her charges being dropped. Certainly nothing that the Ozark County Prosecutor's Office did, and she testified that she didn't receive consideration, that someone else took the rap. Kathy Hilton, she's bad because she has convictions, and those convictions are stealing and forgery, and she's a liar, and she has non-sport convictions. They have to attack Kathy Hilton, Judge. They absolutely have to attack Kathy Hilton, and I know why they're doing it. They have to defend their clients to the best of their ability. But Kathy, there's no reason for Kathy Hilton to lie. She told you she was raised to not harm children. And she told you that these criminal offenses that she was charged with, she hasn't been charged with anything else. She had a bad time in her life. I suspect Kathy Hilton was probably using meth and went on a bender and committed some offenses. But she's clean now. She showed up here the other day. You saw her. And she is on probation and doing well, and has had no charges since 2018. And she was given probation for her charges. You heard that the defense wants to make a large deal about this lockdown, 20 days lockdown, that it's hard and firm. Well, you heard from Amy Macbeth that the jail doesn't always follow the policies, and she didn't know that sometimes offenders serve less than 20 days in lockdown. We heard that through the stipulation of Keith Glenn, the jail administrator, that sometimes if it's their first offense, that 20 days may be reduced. There was no record of Kathy Hilton's lockdown in the Taney County jail records. We stipulated that, and you heard that yesterday. You know, you heard about lockdown procedures in the Taney County Jail about how they operate. It doesn't really sound like a lockdown, Judge. It sounds like they could talk to each other through the door, they could walk throughout the pod, that other lockdown inmates are housed with lockdown inmates together, and that Miss Macbeth Miss Macbeth did not even know. She thought it was a hard and fast rule, but she admitted that they don't always follow the rules in jail with their own guidelines and rules and statutes. Well, not statutes, but the real base of the case, the state's case, Your Honor, is the fact that defendant, by her own admission, hauled Savannah's body up that hill in a truck, which Kathy Hilton knew about, burned it, and then lied about it to scores of people. Just scores of people. Everyone heard that. Everyone thought that she ran away. The manifesto, Judge, she points a finger at everyone. She could have gone to this guy. She could have gone to this guy. Carrie Steves could have come and got him. Carrie Steves is in Minnesota. The snitches corroborate the state's version of events. They corroborate that the defendant murdered Savannah Frances Lee Leckie. Your Honor, after you consider and review all of the evidence in this case, I'm going to ask that the court find the defendant guilty as charged. Thank you very much.
And I don't know what the court wants to say today at this point, but we need to take a break.
We're done.
Okay.
I'm taking it under advisement. We're done. So I'll let you know as soon as I can when I reach the decision.
Judge, do you want to set like a reappearance date or anything like that?
I usually don't.
I will tell the court that I am leaving the Attorney General's office at the as of July 15th.
Well, you're going to beat me out of your system.
I do intend on asking the Attorney General for a special appointment to continue in this case. Mr. Garabrant will continue because he's been appointed as a special KG.
Yeah, I'm hoping to have it decided